Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 28. By way of introduction to what I want to talk about today, I first want to give you a quick recap of episode 21 from several weeks ago. In that episode, I talked about how the impact of sexual assault and rape affects us, mostly in regard to trauma memory and the paratraumatic, or the during the trauma reactions to those types of traumatic experiences, including dissociation, tonic immobility, collapsed immobility, and an impaired ability to even talk about one's own rape or sexual assault. Today, I want to discuss some of the deeper impacts that rape and sexual assault can have on a person, to not only help those of you who've been through these types of traumas to better understand your own reactions to your experience, but in addition, to provide an education to those of you who've never experienced rape or sexual assault on why victims and survivors may be acting the way they act, thinking the way they think, and doing the things they do. But before I go into that deeper dive, I want to emphasize that when someone who has been raped or sexually assaulted actually tells someone else about their experience, they are but a small minority of the actual number of people who've been through that horrific trauma. Because according to prevalence research, most people don't ever tell anyone about their rape or sexual assault. And the number of people who report their sexual assault to law enforcement is even smaller. In fact, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey published in 2020, only about 310 of every 1,000 sexual assaults are reported to law enforcement. Think about that for a minute. That means that 2 out of 3 sexual assaults go unreported. What are some of the reasons for the low reporting rate? Well, part of why I wanted to have a podcast like this was to answer questions like these and many others that come to the minds of victims and survivors. The truth is, there are hundreds of reasons for why someone might not want other people to know that they were raped or sexually assaulted. But let me just list some of the more common reasons for you. Fear of being blamed, fear that there's not enough evidence or proof of the crime, an overall fear of law enforcement or the criminal justice system, fear of reprisal or retaliation from not only the perpetrator, but from friends and loved ones too. The feeling that this type of trauma is a private matter. You just don't talk about this kind of thing. Immense feelings of shame or embarrassment, or both. Religious ramifications or guilt. And of course, the 2 biggies, fear of not being believed and fear of being blamed for your own rape or sexual assault. And the list goes on and on. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, that's just ridiculous. If something that horrible happened to me, I would tell someone right away. While others of you may be thinking, yeah, I would never tell anyone if I were ever raped or sexually assaulted. The simple fact is that none of us really knows what we would do in any given traumatic situation until it happens to us. The important thing to remember, though, and what I want to emphasize, is that no one should be judged in a negative way for their decision to report or not report to law enforcement, or to anyone else for that matter. But here's something else to keep at the top of your mind if you happen to be in law enforcement and you're listening to this episode. Recent research tells us that how you respond to someone who's reporting to you that they've been raped or sexually assaulted is critical to the outcome of both the victim's ongoing recovery from their trauma and to the outcome of the subsequent investigation. About half of the victims of rape or sexual assault who reported to law enforcement said that they were unhelpful or hurtful. And that same research showed that those who experienced a negative response from law enforcement also experienced worse physical and psychological outcomes as a result of those negative responses. Examples of negative responses from law enforcement would be those situations where the officer receiving the report discouraged or tried to persuade the victim not to report their sexual assault, or the officer questioned the victim's prior sexual history, or asking the victim what they were wearing when they were sexually assaulted, indicating that they don't believe the victim's story of sexual assault, blaming the victim for their own sexual assault, shaming the victim in comments made during the report taking, or patronizing and belittling the victim. These types of responses only serve to cause further trauma on the victim and most likely will result in longer emotional healing times and in some cases a complete shutdown of the victim in the investigative process and a very high likelihood that they will never report a rape or a sexual assault ever again. And keep in mind, these types of responses from law enforcement only serve to empower rapists and further the rape culture in our communities. There's a reciprocal response that also influences and impacts both the victim and the investigation of a reported sexual assault or rape. And this is critical to remember if you're a member of law enforcement, but also to remember if you're a family member or a friend of the victim. And that is, positive responses to a victim's report or telling of a sexual assault or rape can provide a foundation for a much healthier emotional and physical outcome to the assault experience. Research shows that victims and survivors who receive positive and supportive responses to their report are able to remember more information, give more details of their experience, and engage more fully with the person that they're telling their experience to when they're not re-traumatized and are given adequate support. And one of the most helpful responses a victim can receive is the feeling of being believed. That is why I am constantly reminding and emphasizing my listeners to start by believing. It's a critical first step in listening to a victim's or survivor's experience. It's also critically important for everyone involved in a sexual assault or rape investigation to treat victims and survivors with a sense of empathy. But let's define empathy real quick. Merriam-Webster's online dictionary defines empathy as, quote, the act of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings and thoughts and experience of another, or the act of imagining one's ideas, feelings, or attitudes as fully inhabiting something observed. End of quote. For our purposes today, let's go with that first definition, with an emphasis on the act of understanding, being aware of, and being sensitive to the experiences of another. You sometimes hear people say that empathy is putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. Well, I'm much more fond of the idea of imagining one's feelings or attitudes because I think at some time or another we've all experienced something terrifying to some degree, and that we can all apply our empathy to the imagining of what someone would want in response to being terrified and assaulted. The late Jody Wygren and Dr. Leslie Leibowitz are two research and clinical psychologists who together wrote an article back in 2005 for the Air Force Sexual Assault Response Coordinator Training Program. It's entitled The Phenomenology of Rape. I refer to it frequently in my training on being trauma-informed because it speaks so powerfully to the ideas and concepts that I believe are most similar to my own experiences of being an investigator of rape and sexual assault cases. There are several aspects of the positive responses I spoke of earlier that Wygren and Leibowitz emphasize in their paper that I want to bring to your attention. And I want to give full credit and attribution of these comments to Dr. Wygren and Dr. Leibowitz and encourage you to read their paper, The Phenomenology of Rape, whether you're an investigator, a victim, a survivor, or any one of you who are interested in becoming more informed about the impact of rape and sexual assault and the reluctance of many victims to tell anyone about their experience. In regard to the topic of talking about one's own rape or sexual assault, Wygren and Leibowitz said, people speak more freely and fully when, and then they went on to list 4 specific conditions under which people are more likely to talk about their experience. I want to talk about those 4 conditions, but first let's discuss what Wygren and Leibowitz meant when they mentioned speaking freely and fully. I think those are 2 very distinct properties when it comes to talking, or they wouldn't have named them separately. To speak freely, I think, means that someone is speaking without any outside influence or expectation of what the spoken content would or should be. It's the freedom to express one's own story without fear of judgment and to speak in any desired order. To speak fully, I think, means to be able to talk without interruption and to be allowed to take one's time in telling their story in as much or as little fullness as the speaker wants the story to contain. So then, what are the 4 conditions in which Wygren and Leibowitz propose that those 2 characteristics, freely and fully, are fulfilled? First, they say that people will speak more freely and fully when they feel they're being listened to. Well, that's easy, you say. Well, not so much. In fact, there's research that indicates that even really good listeners are effectively hearing only about 25 to 27% of what's being said to them, and that only about 25% of that is being retained past 48 hours. If you can learn to be a better listener and give the appearance that you are concerned and supportive, not only will your response suggest to the victim that you're willing to listen to the story, but also that you know how important it is to them for you to hear what they have to say. Secondly, people speak more freely and fully when they feel the listener can tolerate what they have to say. Tolerance to listen to unpleasant information and experiences is not something that the human psyche is designed to do. In fact, it's just the opposite. We tend to tune out those things that are unpleasant and uncomfortable to us. But if you can develop the capacity to not just hear, but tolerate what you're being told, the victim will be more likely to stay engaged, tell you more, and keep talking instead of withdrawing. Thirdly, people speak more freely and fully when the listener can understand what the speaker is saying. And that's not as easy to do as it sounds either. It is incumbent on each of us to learn and understand the vernacular and lingo of sexual terms and innuendo. This capacity helps the storyteller to not have to stop in order to explain themselves and keeps the continuity and connection between the storyteller and the listener. Then, lastly, people speak more freely and fully when the listener can imagine the content of the story to be true. And this goes back to the role of empathy, because to hear about rape and sexual assault, the listener has to be able to feel and experience the story and reflect that empathetic sense back to the victim. Wygren and Leibowitz emphasize in their article that the capacity to listen, tolerate, understand, and imagine the truth of the story isn't easy. And it doesn't just happen because you sit down with someone to hear their experience. Rather, these qualities have to be developed. And in order for these traits and capabilities to be developed, there must be an active, willing, and empathic extension of one's self into areas of human failure and malevolence. And all of this takes practice, constant and consistent practice. All of what I'm talking about entails only a portion of what it means to be trauma-informed. There is so much more involved, but all of it is critical if we're ever going to be able to help victims and survivors tell their stories and then go on to heal and thrive. I'll speak more about what it means to be trauma-informed in future episodes. We'll get more into the topic of how the brain handles trauma and what is actually going on in our brain's trauma responses, including more about trauma memory and the many processes of healing and thriving after trauma. Until then, please do your part in helping to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. And remember that the best way to do this is to start by believing. Also, please remember to tell your friends, coworkers, and other family members about this podcast and let them know what you've gotten out of listening. By the way, you can contact me by email or text and tell me your thoughts about this podcast too. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.